It's a privilege to be able to continue our series in um, dealing with conflict, redeeming conflict. It's a privilege to follow up on what Pastor Ben said last week, sharing our first message. He laid the foundation for our series. So we look forward to developing this over the coming weeks. I'm going to start with something slightly anecdotal as we turn our attention toward conflict resolution. So, Pastor Ben laid the foundation. He helped us understand the nature of conflict, conflict originating in the first act of sin in the Garden of Eden. He gave some really pertinent examples for how often conflict seeps into our relationships and confronts us in our own lives, and gave us a glimpse of where we're going and how we can move forward by God's grace. But this week, we're turning to our response, and really our response as the offender. So, this week, if we summarized some of the questions that we're handling in the content of our series, this week we're going to focus on our response as the offending party in the conflict. Next week, we're going to focus on our response as the offended party in the conflict. Let me just say the title is a little bit of a misnomer because in any given conflict, there's give and take. So, in most all conflict, it's probably true that you have offended the other person, you've sinned against them, and they've sinned against you. So these principles usually apply to each one of us in any given conflict. But as we turn our attention towards conflict resolution and taking ownership of our part, let me start with something anecdotal, and maybe you can identify with this morning or this evening. One of my favorite examples of conflict resolution comes from the animated superhero comedy film Megamind. If you've seen the film, you probably know where I'm going with this. But after a fallout with his head henchman, Megamind, the supervillain turned superhero, he goes back to the secret lair, throws open the door, and shouts into the darkness, "All right, minion, you were right. I was less right." And that maybe that's how you feel in a particular conflict in which you find yourself entrenched and you're trying to think about your responsibility and how you can move forward towards resolution. And humility is going to be a significant part of that. But maybe that's as far as you've gotten. You were right, I was less right. But hopefully, as we take a survey in the book of Proverbs and we look at a collection of Proverbs or a compendium, we can see how we can take action for our part, take ownership of our part of the conflict, and see God by his grace move things towards resolution, to pacify the situation and to move towards reconciliation. Again, we're focusing on our response and taking ownership for our part. All right, so we're going to develop this in 3 steps. And the first step is preventative maintenance. What's the best way to solve a problem? It's to hedge it off, right? To see it before it comes and to avoid it. Let me just try to orient you a little bit to the book of Proverbs and the nature of Proverbs before we dive into some of these texts. One thing that Proverbs is very concerned to inculcate into our living as we try to walk in the fear of the Lord is the quality of prudence. A prudent person, according to Proverbs, has the ability to see the danger coming in the future and make the right choices in the moment to avoid it. And Proverbs has a lot to say with regard to acute sin struggles or temptations in our lives, and especially conflict. So, what Proverbs wants to do for you and for me this morning is to equip us to spot the danger in the future and make prudential steps to skirt around it, and in wisdom, walking in the fear of the Lord to avoid it. So, our first step is a step of preventative maintenance. Let's state the obvious here. You'd do better to avoid conflict altogether, and Proverbs gives us some excellent supporting reasons to simply stay out of it, to avoid conflict. And I think we should really consider these reasons. We should think long and hard here for a couple of different cultural current reasons. And the first I'd say is this: we live in a society that thrives on conflict. Um, there's a reason why tabloid talk shows and trash TV is an entire subgenre of film. People just love to watch other people have all their dirt and dirty laundry exposed on television just to see the conflict that erupts and the things that are exposed, right? People are actually making money off that, which is tragically sad. Um, there's a kind of person who feeds on controversy and sensation. And this genre, entertainment forms like this one, feed that craving. Let's also consider the fact as we think about conflict and how we should handle it from a biblical worldview, that the principles that we discuss tonight apply not only to our flesh and blood relationships, but also to our online presence and our online relationships, right? I think that's important to remember in the day and age in which we live. You know it, I know it. Just because I'm looking at a screen and typing on a keyboard and not a flesh and blood individual, that doesn't give me license to jettison what I know about the fear of the Lord and how I should live life before the face of God, right? So these principles regarding conflict and our relationships and the way we engage and other people apply just as much online. They're probably more relevant online because we think, we can have a tendency to think we can remain anonymous or distant from a real living relationship if we're sitting behind a computer screen or typing on our phone. So, as we go through these principles, let's try to think of applications in those directions. And while we're on the subject of the internet, let me also say that technology and culture has radically changed the way that we think about relationships and we move within them. So just consider for a minute, how many online friends do you have? You know, I'm looking at Mr. Jerry there. He might not be a social media user and have as many online friends as some of the avid social media young people. But think, how many online friends do you have? 1,000? If you're a Bible college student, your number is really high. If you've been out of college for a while, Garrett Martin said on Sunday people start to defriend you, so maybe that number is dropping. But that kind of phenomenon has maybe gotten us to think that relationships are disposable and expendable, right? How many friendships do you really need? Right? But if we're thinking from a biblical worldview, every one of those individuals is made in the image of God and they matter. They have a true dignity and worth, and every relationship is significant and important, bar none. There are no exclusions to that rule. So that's also something we ought to think of and be mindful of when we think about the perspective of Proverbs and a biblical worldview informing our thinking. Just think, if you lived in the ancient world or if you lived in the first century, if you lived in the Bible times, and you were from a village of, say, a few thousand people, and throughout the entire course of your life, maybe you only traveled a few hundred miles from your home, you don't really have the option of burning bridges and just moving on to another group of friends or moving on to other individuals. But those living, breathing relationships from your hometown become very important. It's the stuff that life is made of. And that's truly how the Lord wants us to live life in this world, that people have a kind of dignity and worth because they're made in the image of God and every individual matters. And therefore, conflict and any conflict that is damaging or disrupting those relationships is vitally important to God and ought to be vitally important to us. God made us to live in communion with one another in a true, genuine community, a community of faith. And so let's soak in what God has to say about Proverbs that dictates how we operate in those relationships. We're going to look at several different Proverbs together, which are printed on the handout. We do have more handouts up here. Don Bishop's got them. If you wave your hand, if you didn't get one, we can get one to you. I do want to make sure you have one of those so that you can look on. The Proverbs that we're going to walk through are printed there, and I would love it if you would also find them in your copy of Scripture. Maybe that'll just help you warm up the book of Proverbs, but they're printed there for convenience, if indeed that would be helpful to you. All right, avoid conflict. Now we're getting on to the reasons for which we ought to avoid conflict. And the first is plain, but let's state it anyway. The first is conflict displeases the Lord. All right, why should we avoid conflict? Plain and simple, because conflict displeases the Lord. Take a look with me at Proverbs 6. Please open there. While you're going to Proverbs 6, let me just give a general reminder of the way that the book of Proverbs operates. Proverbs instructs us of how to live life in the fear of the Lord. It has a God-fearing kind of worldview. So it's trying to shape the way that we look at things. It's trying to inculcate wisdom in us that will shape our behavior moving forward. It wants to put a certain kind of lens over our eyes through which we'll see, assess, and evaluate the world that we live in and act accordingly. Let me also remind you by nature what Proverbs are. Proverbs are maxims for life. So the biblical genre of Proverbs is not unlike just the modern day kinds of proverbs that we use. We use proverbial sayings, which are like street wisdom that are designed to be applied at certain times, and they're not necessarily Loctite cause and effect promises. Proverbs aren't necessarily saying you do this and this is the automatic response every time. But they're saying, generally speaking, if you're shrewd, this is the way that life works, and a wise person will know which proverb operates at any given time. And proverbs are meant to be pithy, catchy sayings. They're supposed to stick in your mind and be something that you savor and you turn over in your mind and you think of. So they're supposed to be memorable sayings. So I could tell you, if you do regular maintenance over the course of time, then you'll be spared from massive expense and devastation. Or I could just tell you, a stitch in time saves nine, right? It's a punchy saying that means something, and the wise will know how to apply it. Or I could tell you, if you have too many leaders, if you have too many bosses giving instructions at one time, it's just going to muddle things up. There's going to be a lot of confusion and not a lot of productivity. Or I could say, too many cooks in the kitchen spoils the soup, right? And you know exactly what I mean by that. But then someone might come along and say, well, I thought many hands make light work, right? That's another proverbial saying that gives us street wisdom for how to live life. And you got to know which proverb to apply at which time for the desired outcome. And the book of Proverbs works that way. It gives nuggets of wisdom for those who live in the fear of the Lord to be savored and thought through and applied to particular circumstances. But it's not telling us if you do this in a formulaic way, you will experience this exact outcome like a laboratory experiment every time. So keep that in mind as we look at these proverbs and follow their instructions. Sadly, you might be entrenched in some kind of conflict and you're thinking about what Proverbs says and you say, okay, I'm going to give a soft answer and that's going to pacify the situation. And it doesn't work. Or you think, okay, I'm going to follow what Proverbs says and I'm not going to gossip about that individual because I know that's a key inciter of conflict. And it doesn't work. The conflict is still there and you don't reach the desired resolution. Keep in mind what Proverbs is promising us. Generally speaking, we apply these truths to our lives, we will achieve these outcomes. But there are sometimes other variables in the equation, unforeseen, maybe unknown.